Hi, welcome. I want you to think about a conversation that you've had recently where you asked questions, you even maybe showed some interest, and you kept the conversation going. And the other person, well, they talked about themselves or answered your questions and maybe even went on long tangents, but never once said, "How about you?" And at the end of it, you probably felt a little drained, maybe even a little unseen, and maybe even you questioned, "Am I overthinking this?" You're not. That's what I like to call a boomerang conversation. Everything you put out never really comes back. And we're going to unpack this, but we're going to do this together.
Welcome to Mindful Chatting, a podcast where therapy meets real life. I'm Kristen, a therapist, business owner, and a lifelong student of what it means to fully show up in our relationships, in our work, and in our healing. Here, we unpacked mental health concepts, explore mindfulness tools, and talk through the messy, beautiful, in-between moments that shape us. Whether you're a fellow clinician, a curious listener, or someone navigating your own growth, this space is for you. Let's chat.
So let's talk about what a boomerang conversation is first. I like to call it a one-sided emotional effort. You're asking all of the questions, maybe even showing curiosity and holding some of the space. And the other person, well, they don't reciprocate that. And there's no return. There's no curiosity about you. There's really no mutual exchange going on within the conversation. So let's talk about what reciprocity first is. Connection isn't just about talking, it's about this mutual engagement that happens within conversations. And healthy conversations have this back and forth energy, curiosity on both sides, and some shared attention. Well, what's missing when the connection feels off? Even if you can't immediately explain why. And that's what this reciprocity is talking about. And this isn't always about someone just really being rude. Sometimes it's about this emotional capacity that somebody's bringing into the conversation. So some people really don't know how to be curious. And some people are not used to being listened to, but maybe not listening. And some people feel uncomfortable turning attention outward outside of themselves. And you know what? Some people are just really internally focused. So instead of connection, which is their goal within conversations, the conversation becomes really just about them and they become self focused within that conversation.
If you're nodding along and thinking, yep, this is totally me, I want you to stop and take a free quiz. I have made a quiz about what's your ADHD struggle, and it'll only take a couple of minutes. And at the end, there's a secret freebie waiting for you that will help you start working on your struggle right away. Look in the show notes for the link.
So if this happens every once in a while, we can usually let it slide off our back. Doesn't really impact and rupture the relationship too much. But when this happens repeatedly, you start to feel unseen and unheard and really emotionally drained. And over time, you may stop sharing your information about yourself. You may, over time, stop engaging with that person altogether. Or over time, you may feel disconnected within that relationship because connection requires reciprocity. And if you're not getting that, well, why would I keep putting effort into conversations and within that relationship? So, why do we keep participating? And this is the part that really matters. If you recognize this pattern within your conversation of a relationship, but you keep showing up the same way, I want you to ask yourself, what role am I playing here? Because sometimes we can overfunction in conversations. We can fill the silence for these people. We can keep things going and we can prioritize the other person's experience over our own. But that can be reinforcing this dynamic that this person doesn't have to necessarily reciprocate and bring more into that conversation, which lacks that reciprocity and which is actually destroying the connection between you two.
If you want to understand your ADHD in a deeper way, I've created the ADHD Crash Course, and it walks you through ADHD step by step so that you can actually start understanding your brain and not shaming it. Everything's in small, doable lessons designed for your ADHD in mind. The link is in the show notes.
Let's balance this though. Not every person who does this is selfish, inconsiderate, or intentionally ignoring you. Sometimes it's a lack of awareness, or sometimes it's social habits or social skills that maybe this person never really developed well. Or maybe they just have emotional bandwidth and limitations in that particular moment. But impact still matters. And I want to validate that for you if you're experiencing that within your conversations with people. But let's talk about what can we actually do about it. First, we obviously have to notice the pattern. Awareness is the only first big step to change. Not just about the one conversation. I want you to focus on the repeated behavior, the repeated pattern, and the awareness of when we lock into that dynamic within this conversation of our relationship. And then I want you to do the really uncomfortable thing, which is stop overcompensating. You don't have to carry the conversation because the other person isn't. You don't have to fill every gap of silence, and you don't have to keep it going. But that might mean you might be in a really uncomfortable position where that puts a lot of pressure on that person to fill that space. But we also have to create that space for that person. So if we're always filling in the silence and filling in the gap, there really is no space for that person to come in and maybe fill it with what they need to do, which is reciprocity. So we need to pause, we need to let the silence exist, and we need to let them step in. And then we can redirect the dynamic. So you can say things like, I feel like I've been asking a lot of questions. What do you want to know about me? Sometimes redirecting the person about their dynamic of how they haven't been engaging and giving them space and an opportunity to do so can be a nice, kind of way of socially getting into that space without necessarily confronting them head on. And then one of the things that I think people have a really hard time with is adjusting our expectations of people. Not every relationship will be deeply reciprocal, but you can decide of how much energy you want to give. And this is where I like to call effort matching comes in. It doesn't mean that you show up like a bump in a log because that's not who you are. You like to build reciprocity. But it also might not be that you're putting in so much effort to build this conversation if the person is also not putting in same or similar effort into that conversation or relationship like you are.
Okay, quick pause. Because you've ever found yourself rewinding this episode like 3 times because your brain just drifted, this is for you. I hear this all the time. I can focus, just not when I actually need to. And that's exactly what the focus course is about. Because here's the truth, ADHD isn't a lack of attention, it's a regulation issue, which is why some days you're locked in for hours and other days you're rereading the same sentence, wondering what just happened. So, inside my executive functioning focus course, I break this down in a way that actually makes sense for you. We go through how your attention works in your brain, your specific focus patterns, why you get distracted externally and internally, and how to actually build a system that helps you stay on track and come back when you drift. Because the goal isn't perfect focus, it's knowing how to return without spiraling. So if you're tired of blaming yourself and you just want something that actually works with your brain, I'll link the focus course in the show notes. All right, let's get back to this episode.
I think one of the hardest things that I have to work with my clients on who are in kind of boomerang conversations or boomerang relationships is realizing that just because you're fully showing up doesn't mean that the other person is capable of meeting you there. And I think understanding that emotional gap of where you are and where the person is sometimes really devastating for people because you may be putting a lot of expectations and pressure on a person who might not be able to meet you in that emotional capacity. But that doesn't mean that that person's wrong. It doesn't mean that the relationship is wrong. It's just understanding and accepting the fact that there is a gap between you. And you can still have really deep, good relationships with these people, but a lot of it is accepting where that person's emotional capacity and bandwidth and threshold is without wanting and putting pressure on them to be something that they're not. So, if you're in boomerang conversations or relationships, you're not overthinking it. You're noticing a lack of reciprocity. And the more you start paying attention to how conversations feel for you, the more clarity you gain about your relationships. Because connection isn't just about being heard, it's about being met. I want to thank you for joining me on this Thoughtful Thursday series. And I know maybe this was a very hard conversation, but if you have particular topics that maybe you're interested in exploring and want to know a little bit more about, don't be afraid to drop them in the comments. And as always, be gentle with your mind.
One more thing before you go, and this helps me personally, staying present and grounded, which we all need, especially when your brain wants to spiral into disconnection. Me too. It's Brain FM. It's musically designed to help ADHD brains, well, really anyone's brain, focus, relax, or sleep, and I use it almost daily. If you want to try it, I've dropped my link in the show notes. And if you're looking for planning tools or ADHD-friendly resources, I'll keep a list of my favorite links in every episode.